Mark Selby versus Stuart Bingham, why Selby was simply too good. Mark Selby came into the China Open semi-final with something very important on his side: confidence. Not the kind of confidence that comes from talking or celebrating. The kind of confidence that comes from playing the right way, frame after frame, and knowing that your opponent is going to have to work extremely hard for every single chance. And Stuart Bingham had already done plenty of work himself to reach this stage. But against Selby, the margin for error was incredibly small, because this was not simply a match between two experienced professionals. It was a battle between two very different approaches to snooker. Bingham is capable of producing devastating scoring spells. When he gets a good opportunity, he can clear the table incredibly quickly. And that was exactly what we saw at the beginning of this match. But Selby had something else: control. And eventually that control decided everything. The first frame immediately showed us what kind of match this was going to be. Bingham actually looked comfortable for most of the frame. He was putting balls away and building a lead, but then came one moment of lost concentration. And against Mark Selby, that can be enough. Selby came back to the table and took advantage. He won the opening frame 75-39. It wasn't spectacular. There was no huge century break, but it was classic Selby. Stay patient, stay in the frame, wait for the mistake, and then punish it. Bingham needed to respond immediately, and he did. In the second frame, he showed exactly why he had reached the semi-final. Bingham produced a magnificent century break of 130 and completely cleared the table. Selby didn't even score a point. Suddenly, the match was level at 1-1, and for a moment it looked as if Bingham might be able to turn this into a high-scoring contest. But Selby had other ideas, because in the very next frame he produced his own century, a break of 106. Bingham managed to pot only one red before being forced to sit and watch, and that sequence tells us a lot about the match. Bingham could dominate a frame, but Selby could answer immediately. There was no panic, no frustration, no attempt to force the game, just another big break. And that is one of the biggest differences between Selby at his best and many other players. When his opponent produces something spectacular, Selby doesn't necessarily feel the need to respond with something even more spectacular. He simply does what is required. In this case, what was required was a century, and he delivered it. The score was now 2-1 to Selby. Then came the fourth frame, and this was where the match began to change. Bingham had chances. He was actually in control for a significant part of the frame. He potted the black and blue and appeared to be building the position he needed to level the match. But then came the mistake. An easy red was missed, and Selby was immediately back at the table. This is where playing Mark Selby becomes so frustrating. Against some opponents, you can make one mistake and perhaps get away with it. Against Selby, one mistake can completely change the frame. He doesn't need 10 opportunities. He needs one, and once he gets it, he is incredibly difficult to stop. Selby eventually won the frame 85-22. Now he was 3-1 ahead. Bingham had started the match with a 130 break. He had shown that his scoring was there, but he was already discovering the real problem. He wasn't getting enough second chances, and Selby was making his opportunities count. Then came the fifth frame, and this was another important moment. Bingham needed something, a big response, a frame that would stop Selby's momentum. Instead, Selby produced another excellent scoring performance. He took control of the table and won the frame 75-15. Now the score was 4-1. Suddenly, a match that had looked very competitive at 1-1 was beginning to move rapidly in Selby's direction. And this is where the psychological side of the match became important. At 4-1 down in a race to 6, Bingham had almost no room left. He couldn't simply wait for Selby to make mistakes. He had to create opportunities. He had to take risks. And against Selby, that is exactly what you don't want to be forced into doing. Because the more aggressive you become, the more opportunities you give Selby to use his strengths. Safety, patience, pressure, and tactical awareness. Bingham did manage to fight back. He won the sixth frame, but even that didn't feel like a complete momentum shift. It was more like a necessary response. Selby was still in control of the match, and that distinction matters. There is a big difference between winning a frame and changing the direction of a match. Bingham needed the second. He needed to build another run, but Selby wasn't giving him the chance. The seventh frame was another crucial moment. Selby won it 75-15, and suddenly the scoreboard said everything. 5-2, one frame away from the China Open final. For Bingham, this was now almost a survival situation. He had to win every remaining frame. There was no room for another mistake, no room for a missed red, no room for a poor safety, no room for a bad positional shot. And that is when the pressure becomes enormous. Because when you're 5-2 down against Mark Selby, every shot feels heavier, every decision matters more, and Selby knows how to create exactly that kind of pressure. He doesn't necessarily need to attack you. Sometimes he simply makes you feel that you cannot afford to make a mistake, and eventually that pressure produces one. That is exactly what happened in the final frame. Bingham couldn't find the response he needed. Selby took control, and he finished the match with an 89-5 frame. 6-2, match over, final booked, and perhaps the most impressive thing about Selby's performance was that he never allowed Bingham's best moments to become a sustained threat. Bingham made a 130, Selby made a 106. Bingham had chances, Selby punished them. Bingham tried to fight back, Selby immediately restored control. This was not a match where Selby simply destroyed Bingham with centuries. It was something more complete. He controlled the important moments, and that is why the scoreline ended up being so convincing. 6-2. But there is another interesting aspect to this victory. Look at Selby's route to the final. He beat Pang Junxu 6-3 in the opening round, then he destroyed Kyron Wilson 6-1, and in the quarter-final, he produced another statement performance against Neil Robertson, winning 6-1. So by the time he reached the semi-final, this wasn't an isolated good performance. Selby was building momentum throughout the tournament. And that's important because Selby has always been one of those players who can become extremely dangerous once he finds his rhythm. His form before the China Open had been inconsistent. Earlier in 2026, he had suffered several disappointing defeats, including losses to Mark Allen, Jiang Jun and John Higgins, while he was also knocked out of the World Championship by Wu Yais. But China was different. This looked like a completely different version of Mark Selby, more confident, more decisive, and much more comfortable in the tactical battles. For Bingham, there is still plenty to take from the tournament. Remember, he had already come through qualifying in impressive fashion. He beat Ian Burns 6-4 and then produced a remarkable 6-0 victory over Luca Bressel in the final qualifying round. Then he reached the semi-final of the main event, so this was not a bad tournament for Bingham, far from it. But against Selby, he ran into a player who was simply operating at a higher level. And that's perhaps the best way to explain this match. Bingham had enough quality to beat almost anyone, but Selby didn't give him enough opportunities to use that quality. The first frame was Selby's patience. The second was Bingham's brilliance. The third was Selby's response. The fourth was Bingham's missed chance. The fifth and seventh showed Selby's control. And the eighth finished the job. That is the story of the match. Selby didn't need to play perfect snooker. He just needed to be better in the moments that mattered. And he was. For Bingham, the biggest problem was not his scoring. It wasn't his long potting. It wasn't even his safety game. The biggest problem was that whenever he created an opportunity to change the match, Selby immediately took it away from him. And against a player as experienced as Selby, that is incredibly difficult to overcome. At 1-1, Bingham had momentum. Selby answered with 106. At 3-1, Bingham had a chance to make it 3-2. He missed. Selby punished him. At 4-1, Bingham fought back, but Selby didn't allow that comeback to develop. And at 5-2, the match was effectively finished. That's why the final score of 6-2 doesn't tell the whole story. The match wasn't necessarily 8 frames of one-sided snooker. There were moments when Bingham looked dangerous, but Selby consistently won the moments that carried the most weight. And that's what great match players do. They don't necessarily dominate every minute. They dominate the moments that decide the result. And now Mark Selby was heading into the China Open final. Waiting for him was Noppen Singkum, and that is where this victory becomes even more interesting, because Singkum had already produced one of the most remarkable runs of the tournament. He had beaten Judd Trump, then Ronnie O'Sullivan, then Shaun Murphy, and finally Joe Yuilong in a dramatic 6-5 semi-final. So the final was going to be a fascinating contrast. On one side, Mark Selby, a four-time world champion, a player who had suddenly rediscovered his best form, a player who had just beaten Neil Robertson 6-1 and Stuart Bingham 6-2. And on the other side, Noppen Sinkham, the giant killer who had already removed three of the biggest names in the tournament. But before that final could happen, Selby had to deal with Bingham. And he did it in exactly the way you would expect from Mark Selby at his best. Patiently, clinically, and without giving his opponent enough opportunities to breathe. 6-2, Stuart Bingham is out. Mark Selby is into the China Open final. And after everything we've seen from him this week, one thing is becoming very clear. Mark Selby is not simply surviving this tournament. He is playing like a man who genuinely believes he can win it. And now he has one final obstacle. Noppen Sinkham, the giant killer versus the jester. And that final could be something very special.